Go ahead, Victor.
Hello, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anara Tabashaliva, along with the co-host, Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Chris White, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherrod. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post questions for our guests. A quick greetings for our viewers in Ukraine.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої відваги і сили. Ми дуже вам дякуємо за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you. Today's guest will be introduced by Victor Fett. Please, the rest of us turn off our cameras. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anara. I'm glad to greet Dr. Sergei Erofeev, who joins us from Rutgers University, New Jersey. Sergei is in the United States since 2015. Before, he was a pioneer of post-Soviet global education in Russia and of cultural sociology. By first training a concert pianist, he was working in the area of sociology of the arts, and then he has led as a scholar of cultural industries, policies, ethnicity, nationalism, many international projects for European and American agencies. He served as a vice president of a higher school of economy in Moscow, which used to be the leading Russian university. He was then the dean of international programs at the European University in Saint Petersburg, Russia, and the founding director of Center of Sociology of Culture at Kazan Federal University in Tatarstan, Russia. He also served as a co-principal investigator of the Atlantic Council's project, Putin Exodus, in 2019, which was devoted to the new wave of Russian immigration. Sergei will talk to us today about current situation in the world, in Russia, connected to the war in Ukraine. Please, Dr. Erofeev.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Victor. I'm very grateful to you and to the university for inviting me, and very much look forward to getting some reactions from your audience. And I think it's a fantastic project, and I wish the project every success. It's very important to explain to Americans in the medium of English what is going on in the world and in Ukraine and Russia from the point of view of those people who have first-hand experience in these countries. I have many hats, so I don't actually even know what to start with. I have the hat of an emigre who left Russia for political reasons almost 7 years ago. I have the hat of a university top manager, so I've been developing what was called internationalization of universities in major cities in Russia, including Kazan, Saint Petersburg, and Moscow. But after I came to New Jersey, I got back to my second profession, which is sociology. My first profession was music. My second profession since the 1990s has been sociology, abandoned for a while because I was too busy as an administrator, traveling the world, building new departments, building new programs, etc. But I'm very happy that now I can talk to you with predominantly the hat of a sociologist. And I hope that nobody's scared by this word. Sociology is a science of society, as we all know. But within sociology, you can be either too specialized, or quite popular, or you can see the social and cultural processes from totally different perspectives. It's not a hard science. So I'm not like Victor, who came to this country so many years ago, being in demand, because natural scientists in those years would immediately be welcomed by countries like the United States, Russia having been at the forefront of certain scientific endeavors. It was very, very different with social sciences and humanities. And my profession of academic sociologist practically didn't exist until the 1990s. So one of the first, I became one of the first academic sociologists, technically speaking, in the 1990s in the Soviet Union. 1990 was still the Soviet Union, 1991, and then 1992, as you know, a whole new era started, which is ending in front of our eyes. So those 30, 31, 32 years of certain developments, we are witnessing the end of that era. And that's probably why you are all here. Those who are present online now, and those who are going to watch this video later. I'll be very happy to answer questions from Victor and others almost immediately, but I'll just make a very brief couple of minutes introduction. That simply saying that my sociological interests now mostly revolve around what is going on. So it's very topical in a way. I'm writing and teaching about the war, about how it became possible, what are the scientific methods of analyzing that. And since I'm a sociologist, I'm trying to see what is going on through the prism of culture. In other words, how the perpetrator thinks, how Putin and his power circle think, what they value, what they want, what they are afraid of as a social group. And on the other hand, I'm trying to make sense what the society is thinking. What is it as a something big? What can we expect from the Russians? Because I think it's more or less clear what we can expect from the Ukrainians in this war. But making sense of the Russians through this war is a serious challenge, not only to the journalists of the New York Times, for example, which has been showing declining standards in understanding Russia recently, unfortunately, but also, of course, various politicians, which have shown some progress in understanding the war, understanding the perpetrator, understanding the victim, and understanding those who assist in the crime, in the terrorist crime. I'm talking about various ways of assisting or non-resisting as applied to the Russian society. And of course, to conclude this, I would like to point out that there are many people, actually heroes, real heroes, in Russia today who are resisting the crime, who are resisting this largest crime against humanity since 1945. And as a sociologist, I like to think about those great contributions of the late, well, let's call it the second half of the 20th century science, particularly in this country, which can help us understand the behavior of the criminal, and to rid of the illusions and the fallacies, of which there are two major ones. One is when we think of Putin and his accomplices as partners that you can negotiate, engage in some peace talks, and you can settle the business, thinking traditionally in terms of partnership and negotiation. This is one fallacy. And the other one, which is very, very common, also among the Russian opposition, but I understand why, and I'm sometimes talk to those people because I'm involved with opposition circles in Russia. So the second fallacy is that Putin and his cronies are often seen as madmen, as loonies, some who don't have any rationality at all. Our science teaches us that there's a lot of rationality about it, but it's a different kind of rationality. So if you want to defeat such an evil force, you have to understand its rationality and what are the possible actions of these perpetrators, considering that rational framework. So I'll stop here, and I can answer any questions.
I hope we will be engaging in a discussion now, but as a non-expert, I can only go for analogies and questions. Of course, I prepared a couple of questions. Sergei, if I may, you write recently about war in Ukraine as a threshold moment, as a historical event, and we all agree, whether we call it Third World War or not, it definitely has worldwide implications, and world is much more connected than back in 1940s. So without putting analogies to Hitler or Genghis Khan, what can you tell us about your statement that war in Ukraine will be followed, and probably already is followed, by war within Russia? What kind of war? Hybrid, civil, colonial, anti-colonial. What you think will happen? It's hard to ask a scholar about prognosis, about predictions, but what does your science show at this moment?
Thank you very much for this very good question, Victor. You're right. If you hear from a social scientist that I predict this and this and that, don't take this person as a social scientist. We do not provide prognosis. What we can discuss is various scenarios which are connected to certain scientific framework. And what we know is called data, it's called evidence, and one should operate that evidence trying to build some models of future behavior. But it's not more than just models. At the same time, certain models have higher probability, while the others don't have that high probability. One of the things which was wildly talked about at the very beginning of the war, and I heard it from highly respected academics as well, historians, political scientists, and that was that the war would end within a few days, a week, and Kiev would be captured, and Zelensky would be arrested or ousted, and Putin would win. But none of my serious colleagues in social sciences and sociology would agree to that, even at that early phase. So I would say that the defeat of Putin in Ukraine has been predetermined from the very beginning. And what our science tells us is that there is enough evidence to see how the Ukrainian society was prepared to serious resistance. and even that the Ukrainian army was nothing like 8 years prior to the full-fledged aggression against Ukraine. So the Ukrainian society has been building itself as a new modern nation, and the war has only accelerated this process. So that was clear from the very beginning, as well as the poor state of Putin's army. We knew that. Those who wanted to know, they knew that, unlike some journalists and politicians in the West who had many illusions about that. So the war was lost by Putin on day one of this war. It sounds like a radical statement, but there is truth about it. And we can see in front of our eyes that there is no way Mr. Putin can win a conventional war against a highly motivated army and people of Ukraine. It's simply not possible. Also, Putin miscalculated the degree of Western support and Western solidarity with Ukraine. But this doesn't mean that his aggression was just total lapse of mind. He had his rational grounding for attacking Ukraine. But even a terrorist can miscalculate, as we all know. So the war in Ukraine will come to an end unless Putin decides to venture into something unthinkable or unprecedented. And people are talking about that, of course. So if this doesn't happen, Ukraine is destined to win more or less soon. The other preconception is that many think that for Putin, losing in Ukraine is something totally unacceptable. But knowing Putin's culture, knowing his mafia values, the techniques his cronies are using, I disagree. I think that these people are extremely flexible, much more flexible than we think. And for Putin, when he has nothing but to lose in Ukraine, he will very likely find certain excuses and justifications. And he will use the whole force of his propaganda to explain to the Russians that we have achieved something in Ukraine. It's not a defeat, we just withdraw and we are going to tackle new challenges. But what are going to be these new challenges? And here's my answer to Victor, that the new challenges are growing at much faster pace than the external challenges. The external challenges are there. There is the battlefield and there is the Western support and sanctions against Russia. The internal challenges, that's what is rapidly changing. It will be changing incrementally first, but then we will see it will increase exponentially. So it will be a radical increase of this crisis in Russia, leading to serious internal conflict. So to be very brief, what expects us is Putin's defeat in Ukraine, his withdrawal from Ukraine, and developing civil war within Russia. I call it civil war. Again, it may sound very radical to you, but one should approach it from a rational, scientific standpoint. There are different kinds of civil action. There is already a lot of resistance, as I mentioned in the beginning. There are many heroic people, even on the level of individuals, who go out to the streets with individual pickets, with anti-Putin's slogans. They get arrested. Those who deliver truth about the war face serious punishment, up to 15 years in prison, We know all that, but there are many other social processes which is very difficult to grasp right now. We already hear about the arsenals of governmental offices, in particular conscription points, or they're called military commissariats in Russia. There have been many dozens of them already. There have been uh, sabotage incidents on the railroads, and with the introduction of Putin's mobilization, this general draft to the front, a major shock arrived to Russia, which sent the message to every household, to every family, that the war is here and that the war is about you personally. And what we see now is anything between people avoiding the draft to newly mobilized people shooting each other or escaping from the front lines or surrendering to the Ukrainians. It's a whole boiling hot pot of emotions, rational decisions, resistance in various kinds. So once the mobilization arrived, the first reaction from me was that this mobilization will face four major factors. One is violence. Well, that's not the best translation. The Russian word is произвол. Произвол is arbitrary violence used by the agencies of authority and people of authority against the ordinary and general population. So that's one thing, violence. The other is chaos, because Putin's system is even less prepared for a mobilization like this than it was for the full-scale aggression in February. Number three is corruption. Corruption is everywhere. In Russia, it's the basis of Putin's system of power. And number four is sabotage. So violence, chaos, corruption, and sabotage are the factors which will determine the complete failure of this mobilization, any new efforts by Putin and his cronies to try and win this war. So the war is lost, and any further series of events just prove that. It's only the matter of time and cost, when and how the war will be ended and Putin will be defeated. But what is happening in Russia shows that the war may well arrive to the Russian soil, because my main argument is that Putin has been preparing for this course of action for years and years and years. And one major factor for deciding to start this war for him was not only, that Ukraine was weak and the West was not supportive and that the Russian army was excellent. These are all miscalculations. But there is also one factor which is much more secretive. We simply don't know what is really going on. But we can easily assume, knowing Putin's mafioso type, terrorist type, cultural organization, that he probably by February 2022 thought that he has brought his inner security system, personal security system, to the maximum. And he is quite likely to be paying the greatest attention and allocating the greatest resources exactly to that. Not so much to the troops on the ground who are now more and more not equipped and even unarmed and easily defeated sometimes by the Ukrainians. But really what matters most for him is his inner circle, is his personal security. And in that sense, I think that the resources for Putin, for retaining his power, staying in power, are still quite high. because we don't see any signs of internal split, the system cracking yet, only some small hints. So probably that's a very, very high stability of that factor for him. And I assume, from my scientific standpoint, as an observer who can operate some data, I think that for Putin, the cost of losing the war in Ukraine is lower than the availability of resources of retaining his power. Victor, am I being clear? So I'm just trying to explain that at the moment, the chances of Putin to stay in power somehow while losing the war in Ukraine are still high. So he loses in Ukraine, but he still stays in power. This goes contrary to some people's reasoning who say that immediately once Putin loses his war in Ukraine, he's done. He will be immediately arrested by God knows whom, his cronies, or he will be assassinated by through Ukrainian diversions or whatever, some kind of sabotage. I don't buy that easily. This is all very speculative. What is not speculative is that Putin still has enough resources to continue, but he cannot continue without a war. He has already entered this war, and he can't make peace with his own people. He's been drastically losing in popularity since the beginning of the war, and especially after September 21st, after the start of this mobilization campaign. So that's my answer to your question, that what awaits us can be called a civil war in Ukraine, in this or that form. And I don't just easily buy the argument that it's totally up to Putin's inner circle to remove him, that there will be a coup d'etat, a palace coup sooner or later. As a social scientist, I always think about the external factors. There are external factors connected with international pressure and the battlefield in Ukraine. But the other external factor for Putin and his system, his inner circle, is the behavior of the Russians. And they are his arch enemies. The Russians are Putin's greatest enemies, not the Ukrainians and not even the Americans.
That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating. And actually, my question was going to be about the inner circle. I'm assuming that they have an accurate sense of what is going on, both in Ukraine and in Russia, among the Russian people. They are in a very interesting position. So my question would be, do they have an accurate sense of what's happening? I'm assuming Putin has an accurate, but I don't know. I don't know. Do all the people involved have an accurate sense of what is happening? Are they choosing to not have an accurate sense of what is happening? And I'm not talking about his personal security detail, although I'd be curious to see what you think of that too. How, as far as who dictates what the reality is, if you would be so kind as to speak on that, like how does that work when you have a powerful person surrounded by cronies whose safety depends on his being in power? At the same time, he's imperiling them by what he's doing. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you very much, Katerina. Well, I think that in a way, more and more people now can trace certain signs of Putin's system starting to crack. The most commonly discussed phenomenon is that of Putin's chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and the Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, who are becoming very outspoken, criticizing the Russian top brass and the Russian army. Usually such behavior would be considered by comparative political science, by historical sociology, as signs of the system weakening. So it's a very important sign. The other thing is that the system is like a black box. we can't really say who decides what, but there are many indirect signs of how the system works. Many people will remember the meeting of the Russian Security Council a couple of days before the war started in February. And we saw that crowd, and we saw that Putin was the only person who was interested in this war. All his cronies are losing from what is happening. Uh, some in a very direct sense, they can't travel abroad, they can't have assets abroad anymore, although all their dreams of a better future for themselves and for their children were connected with the open world. Russia has been developing as an open country, and the children of the most privileged members of the society, the people who are at the top of the power pyramid, they would be absolutely and totally oriented to the West. And we perfectly know that even those cronies like the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, they were brought up as intelligent people who benefited from that openness. And Lavrov was a total Democrat, supporting ties with America and the European Union up to a certain point. So these people are all shocked, terribly scared, and their only choice, which is visible now, is to fully support Putin's agenda and engage in all kinds of outrageous discourses of war, fighting Nazism, opposing Western American imperialism and whatnot. So they have to be using that kind of language because at the moment, that's their structural situation. So such people, they behave as any normal person. And any normal person, again, talking from the point of view of our social science, any normal person is an economic agent. So we behave like we would behave in the marketplace. We weigh chances, we make choices, we weigh opportunities and threats, costs and benefits. And this goes on and on. And as the war continues, it becomes clear for us that these people at the very top of the Russian power system, obviously having lost many things because of the war, they will continue to weigh these costs and benefits, and that at certain point, when the external pressures of various kinds, like losing in the battlefield in Ukraine, facing this growing discontent of the Russian society, these people will have to think again about the possible outcomes of their actions. One important tool to contribute to that kind of pressure on them is introduced by Alexei Navalny, his Anti-Corruption Foundation, and what is called the list of 6,000. In fact, there are now more than 6,000 people in that list proposed to the governments of the free world countries so that they could sanction these people. Sanction for a number of reasons. It can be direct warmongering, because these people are instigating and promoting this war and helping Putin in his crimes. But they could also be people who have brought down the democratic remains of the Russian political system. Those who have contributed to electoral fraud, those who promoted Putin as the national leader, ignoring his previous crimes in Russia. Of course, he started with Russians. Ukrainians came second. And this list, as I said, is proposed as a list for future sanctions. And in fact, some people, about 800 of those, have already been sanctioned. But the point is, it's not sanctions for the sake of sanctions. It's an instrument to pressure those people to denounce Putin, to openly come out against him and try to contribute to the general fight against Putin on the three fronts. One is being the Ukrainian battlefield front. The second is Western sanctions against Russia and arms supply, etc., to Ukraine. And the front number three, the war theater number three, which is becoming more and more visible now, is Russian people themselves. So these 6,000 people who are Russians but have influence, some of them, well, it's all the top Kremlin people, first of all, but also many others, all the way down to the regions in Russia, and actors, musicians, bloggers, those who have contributed to the tragedy which is unfolding in front of our eyes. So the next logical step would be to turn this list from sanctioning strategy to arrest strategy. So it takes a lot. So Katerina, I think thinking about this internal conflict, it's important to understand how difficult it is to transition from portraying and understanding Putin and his system as side of the conflict, although kind of criminal side, to transition to understanding similar to that what happened in 1939, when Putin, when Hitler was eventually labeled as the enemy of humankind, to be eliminated or to be removed from power at least. So at the moment, as we can see, the American government, the European governments, they are not talking about Putin to be removed. They say the Russians should deal with that. That's the internal problem. And they're absolutely right. But if Putin commits something unspeakable, and he may, or he just simply continues with this total devastation of Ukraine and its people, then I think enough will be enough. It's possible that enough will be enough, and Putin may be declared a criminal to be persecuted to the degree that all his cronies, wider circles of his cronies, should also be persecuted. So it's a long answer to your question, Katerina, but I hope I'm being clear. There are already instruments there. And there's another instrument similar to the one proposed by Navalny's team. That's the list of Yermak and McFaul. Yermak is the head of presidential administration of President Zelensky in Ukraine. So it's a similar instrument. And of course, there has been talk for a long time that an international special criminal court should be established so that every crime will be accounted for and the right punishment will find its way to Putin and who helps him. My point is very simple. Once those people in Russia, people of power in Russia and people of influence in Russia start realizing that it's not just about sanctioning them, it's not about just freezing their assets in the West and closing the gates of Western countries for them, but it's actually a serious threat of spending the rest of your life or much of your life behind the bars, because Putin is not eternal. Some of them think that he's very lucky, that he knows what he's doing. There is a kind of faith, almost kind of religious faith, devoid of human principles, but technically it's something which makes them believe that Putin will endure. And they still weigh their costs and benefits within that framework. So they will have to see, they will need to see that the end is coming. And after that end, their personal destiny may be really very pitiful. And it's best to do something now to prevent the worst. So back to your question, we don't know exactly who is doing what at every moment in time, but the system is disintegrating slowly. At some point, it can start disintegrating very rapidly. You can call it a revolution, or maybe there will be sort of palace coup or something, but the conflict in Russia will continue. It may be very, very hot if Putin has enough resources to stay in power. But again, I just want to say, it would not be reasonable from the point of view of social science to rely on some palace coup tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. We shouldn't be simply thinking about that. Equally, we shouldn't think in terms of engaging with the perpetrator of this kind, that we can pacify him and we can just draw some ceasefire lines in Ukraine today or tomorrow, that there is less violence. This is a direct road to losing, because we are not dealing with traditional rationality, but we're dealing with terrorist rationality. Putin will continue to fight to the very end. So if he's not removed from power by force, he may commit suicide, and he will most likely commit suicide. The question is in what form and what costs, what collateral damage will be involved in Putin's suicide.
Thank you so much. It's so helpful to have a sociologist's perspective on all of this. And I want to add too that I really enjoyed reading your column, How the War in Ukraine Can Turn into a War in Russia. I thought that was incredibly well written and helpful and clarifying for someone like me who's trying to get a better sense of what everything is. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Katerina.
We have more people here. Please ask questions. Chris?
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation and for your detailed answers. One of the things that came to mind when you were talking is, especially building off the last thing you said about suicide, the parallel that I think of course, is Hitler in his bunker in Berlin in April 1945. And it led me to wonder, I mean, the circumstances that would lead to Putin doing that would be if there's an existential crisis for him, right? Maybe his
Absolutely.
life's in danger. So it seems, I mean, is there any possibility that Ukraine could at some point press its advantage and go into Russia and threaten Russia in the same way that, for example, Russia or the Soviet Union threatened Germany at the end of World War II?
Thank you, Chris. It's a very good question. Well, the most immediate answer is it's not in the interests of the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian people to go into the Russian territory, apart from hitting those missile launch sites. It's a totally legitimate target right now, I think, but there is no way Ukrainians would be interested in the Russian territory. What I'm trying to explain in conversations like that is that Putin can afford to lose the war in Ukraine, but he cannot afford to lose his war with his arch enemy, the Russians. That he cannot afford unless he's offered some very interesting deal, Napoleon-style deal. Just go away. We'll provide you with a beautiful Pacific island. You will have your golden palace there. You'll be totally safeguarded by UN forces there, etc. Just go. I don't know if it will work, but you are right when you ask, when you talk about cornering. And Putin is not cornered yet. And looking at his type of deviant behavior, criminal terrorist behavior, he's not going to be cornered after being pushed out of Ukraine, if he provided he can still ensure his personal security for a certain duration of time. But then inevitably a moment will come when Putin will be cornered. I don't believe that after his defeat in Ukraine, Putin can endure for another 10 or 20 years in Russia. Russia is not in that state anymore. It doesn't have the same sort of revenues. It doesn't have the same sort of stability. And anti-Putin sentiments have increased dramatically. Every I would say maybe 70–80% of people in Russia are totally against this war. Totally against it. You can't trust the Kremlin opinion polls. You have to make your judgment following conversations with people, and that's what my colleagues do. So-called qualitative sociologists who draw their conclusions from the data of different kind, and that data is talking to people, conversations, observations of their behavior. This tells us that provides us with a totally different picture. So Putin has no way, in my view, to endure for very long in that civil war in Russia. It can be different kind. It can be mild civil war. It can be very hot civil war, but he cannot endure. It's pretty obvious now. So what he will do, unless he's removed by force, arrested or killed or kidnapped by Martians, whatever, he will have to kill himself. And the parallel with Hitler is a very legitimate parallel here. The question is how Putin will kill himself. He cannot lose face completely. He's a Russian gopnik. He's a Russian mafioso type. He gang type person. They have their own code of honor. They try to pretend that they never give in, that they never admit to their mistakes, especially the leader of such a gang. But on the other hand, they have to admit to their mistakes in some indirect way. And the final solution for such people has been described by sociology for more than a century, in fact. We often think that suicide, all the more political leader suicide, is something extremely existential, extremely individual. And we look at people like Hitler. But the science tells us that any most intimate decision is totally socially conditioned. We can think of egoistic suicide. Egoistic suicide is something when the person sends a signal to the world, to the social world. Everybody hates me, I hate myself, I'm totally misunderstood, so I better leave this world. And that's what probably awaits Putin. And I had a very interesting discussion with my students at Rutgers about that, because given his system of beliefs and values, he will probably be extremely afraid to be torn apart like Gaddafi. You know, he's a coward. There have been many indicators of Putin being a coward. He's afraid of communicating with people in the times of the pandemic. We know that. Everybody remembers this infamous 6 meters long table when he sat together with President Macron of France. Even his own generals couldn't approach him so close up till recently, when he started to think that maybe the pandemic is really down now. So Putin's a sybarite. He's someone who values luxury very much, because this luxury is a sign of status for him. For him, there's no power without conspicuous consumption, showing off, proving to other people that you're special, and encouraging your cronies to be so also special. That's how the system of rule is built in Russia and perpetuated, very importantly. So for him, suicide is a very likely thing. Instead of being arrested and facing humiliation in The Hague, like Milosevic, and especially if it's not a beautifully organized, I don't know, US Navy SEALs, commando sent to Kremlin to kidnap Putin to secure that he stays alive. We don't know. It's hard to imagine. It's more likely in Putin's mind that he will be captured and mutilated and whatnot by some people who hate him. Almost everybody around Putin hates him. Maybe only just less than a dozen people around him who don't hate him, because everybody's in a loss. So that's a very, very high probability of Putin's end. And we have this historical parallel with Hitler, but Hitler, he shot himself. And there are two big differences between Putin and Hitler, because number one is that Hitler was a man of ideas. Putin is not. Putin is not a Hitler. Putin is not a Lenin or a Trotsky. He doesn't think in terms of changing the world to the better within his weird framework of references. So he's a very practical mafioso who just wants to fully secure his social position of full control, domination over certain territory, and sharing the world with other powerful people of his kind. He thinks that all the other world major leaders are similar mafiosi like him. So that's one thing. He has no idealistic structure of beliefs. The second important thing is that he, unlike Hitler, has the bomb. And he can just blow himself up in the end instead of shooting himself like Hitler. And one reason is that it's the most painless way of ending one's life. Because the signals from your neurons don't even reach your brain before you evaporate, turn into nuclear ashes. So it's a very painless way, even less painful than cyanide or morphine. So that's a very, very efficient. And on top of everything, if Putin ever thinks of his trace in history, if he wants to be remembered and to show his remorse, his resentment, and his understanding of losing the world and himself and his empire, and therefore killing himself, I think that he would think in terms of what in Russian is called «помереть так с музыкой». If you are to die, do it with music, leave with a bang. And what can be more beautiful in Putin's eyes than taking his life with lives of dozens of hundreds of thousands of Muscovites, his main enemies, his arch enemies, at the very end, when he's really cornered, then there will be enough music for him to be remembered, and a very painless way to leave this world.
Thank you so much. Very articulate. A lot to think about.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. This was amazing, and you almost built a movie finale here. Although I doubt we will have movies like this if this really happens very soon. People will be busy otherwise. If what you are saying, Sergei, is not just your fantasy and others might consider it rational, what are people to do? And what happens?
This is the old wisdom. Do what you must and be what may. We should be very firm with perpetrators and terrorists of this kind. We cannot get under Putin's skull, into his black box. But what we know from history, from observable social behavior, tells us just continue fighting on all the fronts. And the front number 3, which is now in its nativity, sort of, should be really helped. So we should help the Russians to help us in the West and in Ukraine. And this will send a very clear signal to Putin that nobody is afraid of his nuclear blackmail. This is a practical conclusion, by the way, from what may be seen by some people as my fantasies. It's not a fantasy, it's one of scenarios. And we know that suicides happen, and they happen in different ways. And we are dealing here with a person of huge, enormous power. So I would say that this kind of reasoning should explain us very clearly that Putin will not rush to leave this world. And therefore, he's unlikely to use nuclear weapons or some other absolutely unprecedented, unspeakable methods in the battlefield now. He should be pushed out of Ukraine, and let's see what happens next. So he is not ready to die yet. He's not cornered yet. Well, I don't rule out that if there is a serious defeat like losing Kherson or losing even Crimea, that some people will just organize a palace coup in Moscow. I don't rule that out. But again, my point is very simple. It's not scientific enough to rely on that and endlessly talk about that. It's more scientific, maybe not entirely scientific, but it's more scientific to facilitate a course of action when Putin realizes that he's seen by the rest of the world as a mafioso terrorist type. And he will be pushed out of Ukraine, and he will have to face his own people. Maybe at a certain point, the West, and maybe Ukraine too, will decide to help the Russians to fight Putin, not only in symbolic terms, but maybe in some more practical terms. But that's a subject of a different conversation.
Thank you very much. It was so intense and informative. We might have time for a couple of more questions from the audience. We have been here for an hour. I have a question from Leonard Deutsch. Leonard, please.
Okay.
Actually,
Judith has a question.
Yes.
Okay, my question is kind of a sociological, psychological question. Do you think that the genesis of this war was more influenced by cultural consequences or events, or by the psychological demons that Putin has?
Oh, thank you very much, Judy. I know how seductive it is to think in terms of psychological demons. No, I'm a social scientist and I'm a sociologist, and a more narrow area is sociology of culture. Culture understood as systems of beliefs and values. Okay, so I always look at such social phenomena as Putin and Putinism through this prism. And I admit, apart from the structural factors, there are individual factors as well when we cannot really figure out exactly all the nuances and facets of a certain person, remorse or determination, etc. These are indeed psychological things. I have no means of measuring that. What I can measure, and my colleagues can measure, is the state of the society, is the state of the society subjected to aggression. It's the state of Western societies and Western governments. And it's also the historical, structural, cultural determination, if I may say that, of the current behavior of the perpetrating group. So we have that group of perpetrators, and the perpetrator number one, because I think by now almost everybody agrees that this is Putin's war. He's the only person who benefits from this war, not even his closest cronies who had beautiful life before. So yeah, the simple answer to this uneasy question is that culture matters. Culture influences our political and even economic behavior. That's actually how America became a reality. Without the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago, there would be no capitalist America with its Declaration of Independence and its constitution. So culture matters. The changed attitude to the world, changed attitudes to corruption, be it Catholic Church in the 15th, 16th century, or be it the Russian new rich and the Russian privileged elite. So all these things matter a lot. And the Ukrainian case is a very, very bright example, because Ukrainians could no longer tolerate the corruption of that post-Soviet type. They ousted the president who betrayed their ideals, their practical interests. They wanted to be with Europe. They wanted to have the rule of law. They wanted prosperity. They wanted openness, equal opportunity, and all of that. So these are all cultural things. And if such cultural factors work for general populations, which are progressing, are capable of progressing, then similarly, these cultural factors work for those who oppose this path of modernization and democratization. So they have their interests, and the structure of their interests is a cultural thing, the way they want to live, their way of life. And this defines the course of political action and the economic behavior and their interaction with the external world.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you very much. I think Anara had another question. Anara?
Thank you very much for a remarkable presentation. As I understand, the end of Putin might be sudden and surprising. We don't know. What do you think about possible scenarios of dissolution of Russian Federation, or possibility of a so-called color revolution in Russia?
Thank you very much, Anara. But the color revolution in Russia has been going on for 30 years. The problem is it hasn't materialized. And there have been waves. We know what happened in the winter of 2011-12, not only in Moscow, but throughout the country. And then another wave, 2017, following just simple anti-corruption investigation by Navalny's team. So another wave of colored political action, if I may say so. And then in 2019, during the Moscow regional parliamentary elections, more, which caused Putin to change the constitution the next year, 2020. So what awaits Russia, again, social scientists cannot predict, but we can outline the structural conditions of some future developments. Very often we hear now that Russia may fall apart like it happened to the Soviet Union. It's a very simple extrapolation by analogy, if you see what I mean.
I was going to try something.
Yeah, that will be a definite simplification. Russia has, you know, a lot of a lot in common between different regions. Of course, there is Tiva and there is Chechnya, but there is a language. There are similar cultural and economic practices. There are similar interests. Every region, including Chechnya, people of those regions are interested in freedom and democracy. So they all need roughly the same. How that can be achieved, we don't know. So theoretically, some disintegration is possible if certain regions decide to take their own path. The most easy example here would be Saint Petersburg, because it's just next to Finland. And there has been a certain history of this movement called Ingria, in Germanlandia, Ingria movement, free Ingria. So what if in the situation of total chaos in the center of power, Saint Petersburg decides to go free and to secede from Russia? Maybe for a while, who knows? We don't know that. We don't know that. What makes this case different from the Soviet Union is that the Soviet Union was really an empire, and certain parts of that really had to fall off. No question about that, including Ukraine. Russia is different. Russia is much more cohesive. It needs infrastructural development so that people from Omsk to Tomsk can get easily without flying via Moscow, just figuratively speaking. So these economic and cultural and political interests of the majority of Russian regions are very, very similar. And that's what is the position of Navalny, Leonid Volkov, his right-hand man, and generally many progressive oppositionists in Russia. But at the same time, it's their political stance, and political stances are different from scientific approaches. Like, for example, Leonid Volkov and Navalny himself, they can often refer to Putin as a madman. But that's a part of their political technique. That's the way for them to push the message, attract more supporters, etc. As social scientists, we shouldn't think in those terms. We should think in terms of specific rationality and not madness. For someone like Leonid Volkov, Russia has no reasons whatsoever to disintegrate after the collapse of Putinism. As a social scientist, I may have some doubts about that. Although I understand also Volkov's arguments why Russia will stay as just one entity, political entity.
Thank you. That's very interesting scenario that we will see.
Thank you very much, Sergei.
Yeah.
I
Thank
think
you,
if we have no more questions, we have been here for more than an hour, and we will thank Dr. Erofeev for his time profoundly and for his great insights.
Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
We would like to conclude, as we always do, by Katerina Shrey doing a greeting in Ukrainian to our viewers in Ukraine. Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Katerina, your microphone is.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ці часи нас дуже лякають. Ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молимось за кінця цієї страшної війни. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.